Hello everyone and welcome to the channel. I'm Emmanuel, I'm an Airbus pilot, and welcome to our descent preparation tutorial in the iniBuilds Airbus A350 InMax Flight Simulator. So first of all, the question, when exactly do we start our descent preparation? Well, from your typical short-haul operation, you're probably used to starting it at about 80 to 100 miles out. On the long hauls, we do that a little bit earlier just because, we don't fly that often, we may not see all the destinations as often, so we just take ourselves a little bit more time. In general, if you start the descent preparation some 20 minutes before, or even a bit earlier, like right now, 160 miles, that's normally the latest point where I would actually start them. So from here on, the first thing we're going to do is to find out the general conditions around our arrival. So number one, we are going to go to the init page and just do another wind request to be sure that we have the very latest data available. So we can cross-check that. Once it actually arrives, we can insert it, and down here on the wind page we can check that something sensible is actually in here in the descent panel. So that's the very first thing we do down here. Now, when that is done, we can go ahead and grab our destination weather, and we can do this through the ATC com page down here, and then you go to the DATIS page, and if you hit update all, then that's going to update all the airports entered over here, most importantly your destination and your alternate. And we can see that Vienna at the moment has wind 160 at 4, cavalcade 3 degrees, QNH 1022. Whenever the QNH is received, we also pre-selected both on the ISIS down here as well as on the selector up here. And note that the A350 is different from the A320 and A330 in that with standard selected, if you simply dial or turn the knob over here, you can actually pre-select the QNH in the top corner over here. Really useful function. Now, when that is done, we move over to our charts, and we're going to prepare our arrival charts. So let's go over into the terminal charts, click our destination and hit search, and then let's have a look into what we have. So I'm going to go to the chart clipboard over here, remove any of those Istanbul charts. Now we've got Vienna next to Whiskey Arrival, that's a fairly good thing to start with. And then we need our transitions as well. So let's have a quick look at that chart, and it ends at Pesat, so let's find the arrival transitions. In the real world, you would already have gotten the landing runway from the ATIS. Unfortunately, in the sim right now, we don't have that here, so let's just stick to runway 34, because that is what the real flight landed on earlier today. Now, from Pesas, we will probably need an approach transition, so let's go ahead and see if we can find that somewhere. So Pesat 1 uniform, no, that's not it. 5 November, yeah, that looks like it. So Pesat 5 November, let's go ahead and pin that down here as well. Then we can go to the approach page, and we're going to pin the ILS approach runway 34. And last but not least, I also want the airport page and the parking stands. And with that, we now have a nice chart clipboard that provides us with quick access to any of the charts we may need. Another one that you can be interested in is the reference page, because it includes the radar minimum altitudes, which can be fairly useful, especially when you are operating in mountainous terrain, as we have over here just about 30 miles from our destination. So that much about the chart clipboard, which is now fully prepared. Next, we're going to check the status page of the ECAM. Over here, we basically just want to review if any malfunctions had previously existed. Nothing over here. Very neat. Alright, so before we go ahead and check anything in the FMS, let's calculate if we can actually land. There is no sense doing all that FMS setup just to find out that you gotta divert and do it again, right? So let's go down here into the landing performance. I'm going to synchronize the FMS over here, which brings in Vienna and runway 34, 3,600 meters available. We can also synchronize the weather, ensure the correct runway condition, so it's a dry, wet, which flap setting we are going to use, whether we land manually or with an auto land, Then we can select the brake mode. Now that one isn't interesting, since we will be using brake to vacate. So you only have manual, which is maximum manual braking, so really the hardest braking you can get. And then you've got medium, which is like the highest that the auto brake is going to provide to you. And we got to select if we're going to use the reversers or not. Today we are not going to use them, aka we will only use idle reverse. When all of that is done, hit compute, and you can now see that it's going to calculate our landing distances down here, which is 1,519 meters. Adding the 15% performance factor, we get our stop margin, which is 1,854 meters. So we now know that we can land on this airport. Alright, now that we're done with that, we can actually go ahead and start to program our FMS. So for that, we start on the flight plan page. Then we can select the plan mode over here at a good range, such as 20 miles. Open our arrival chart, and now we're going to go over the entire arrival and ensure that everything in our FMS actually matches what we have on the chart down here. So let's go ahead and have a look. We're going to scroll through the flight plan over here, entering the start at NATEX between flight level 80, between altitude 6000 and flight level 140, which we have in here, and then we can continue on towards PASAT above 6000 feet. From there we join the approach transition, so let's get that chart up over here. So via PASAT we basically check that everything in here is the same as it is according to the approach chart. Then we eventually end up on the ILS, so let's bring that one up. And we cross-check. We've got the Fox India 34 at 7.4 miles from the runway in 3000, and that's the one we have right over here. We do have a 3-degree glide path checked on the FMS versus the approach chart. And now let's have a look at our go-around track. And that is straight ahead to the Delta 339 Juliet point, which is at 9.8 DME Fox Mike Delta. And then it's a right-hand turn back to the VOR, climb to 5000 to hold, which we have got in here. And with that, the legs page is checked. Now, if you want to know what altitude you should be at in case you might get some shortcut, then you can do that through the secondary flight plan. So if you go into the secondary and just go back to Sec1, import the active, then go down here to flight plan, then you could go ahead and, for example, after that waypoint over here, you could fly direct down here. You could insert that by going for the next waypoint. If you did that, so after PASAT to Whiskey Whiskey 974, which we can do down here, PASAT, and then insert next waypoint as Whiskey Whiskey 974. Did that over here. Now the secondary is going to recompute with the actual shortcut, and then you can just copy that over from here to the active flight plan. Unfortunately, the iniBuilds aircraft doesn't do that at the time being, but that is how you would do it in the real world, and then you could modify your restrictions over here. So for instance, if we just scroll down a little bit, you can see PASAT is maybe some 20 miles from the final fix. So if we are down here in, let's say, 7,000 feet, that would provide us with the ability to turn straight to the final over here. So now I'm going to find PASAT down here. I will click on that constraint and I will change it to an at or below 7,000 feet constraint. That way we have mitigated for a possible shortcut that we may receive on the arrival. So let's insert that. And now our top of descent gets recalculated for this. Now, once we are done entering and modifying the flight plan page, we can move on to the performance pages. And we're going to start down here on the descent panel. So we are going to check that the descent speeds are as desired. So normally something around 300 knots is good. Always depends a little bit on your cost index, of course, and on the local conditions. We can check the transition altitude down here, or rather the transition level. Now, the transition altitude is 10,000 in Austria, and with a QNH above 1013, that means our transition altitude is going to be flight level 110. So let's go down here, 110, and enter. Thank you. Now, from there, we are going to move down to the position monitor page, and we're going to enter our landing runway threshold. So Lima, Oscar, Whiskey, Whiskey, 34, enter. And then we go back to the performance page and onto the approach page. Now, let's bring up the ATC com page on the right hand side so that we can show our destination weather down here. And when we're doing that, we can start entering our landing information. So, wind 160 degrees, you press enter and you can see the cursor automatically jumps to the next appropriate field at 4 knots. The outside temperature is 3 degrees and the QNH is 1022. Alright, next it wants our approach minimum, and that one's available on the ILS chart. The A350, 900 and 1000 are both category Charlie aircraft, so you can use the Cat Charlie minimum, which is 794 feet on this particular procedure. So let's go 794 and enter. Now, we gotta decide if we want to do a config 3 landing or a config full landing. Config 3 basically provides fewer or less fuel usage while slightly increasing the approach speed. Let's select it and see how great the difference is going to be. 3 knots, so not all that much of a difference, as you can see. So we can go back onto the landing performance page and select landing config 3 over here, see how we like it. You can see it only uses a couple meters more landing run, so there is absolutely nothing that would prevent us from doing a config 3 approach on this approach. So that is selected as well. Then we go on to the go-around panel. In here we check the thrust reduction and acceleration altitudes, by default 1000 above the field, and the engine out acceleration, which normally we would just set to the MSA. So that's 3600 up here in the north. So let's enter 3600 for the engine out acceleration altitude. So 3600 and enter. Alright, and that's the descent panel completed. So now we can move on to the init page and onto the fuel and load page, where we can check the extra fuel and extra time that we're going to have at our destination airport. When that is done, we set up the secondary flight plan, where we could, for instance, enter shortcuts, or we could enter a different landing runway if we are not 100% sure of which runway to expect. The only thing you got to be careful with on the secondary flight plan is when you go to the secondary performance page and to the secondary approach page, you got to ensure that the information entered here in the weather is exactly identical to your primary flight plan's approach panel. If those are different, then the FMS can reset itself and lose all information. That's a real world bug in the real aircraft. So just to mention that one. Now, when that is done, the last thing we're going to go into is the nav aids, and over here we could manually tune any nav aid needed for the arrival. Now again, we are doing full PBN operations over here, so that is nothing that we really have to worry about. The only thing you gotta know over here is if you are flying a localizer only approach, then you gotta select deselect glide. If you're flying an ILS, don't deselect the glide, obviously. And that concludes the entries in our FMS. So from here, we are going to move on to the further checks that we gotta do. On the cruise page, we gotta check our landing field elevation up here to be correct. If that's incorrect, you can always do a manual entry up here. Now, moving on from there, let's prepare to set up our brake to vacate system. We do this by zooming down here below 10, and that's going to automatically load up the airport map of our destination if you have a Navigraph subscription, which I figure most of you have, so I'm only going to talk about that topic right now. So that's our destination airport Vienna down here. And down here we first of all select the landing runway, so put your cursor above the runway threshold until you see the box, click on it and then select landing runway. Next we're going to select the exit that we wish to use, and for this it's important that we've entered the correct runway state. You can see right now it says water or slush. Well, you can change that up here. So since it is dry, let's go ahead and select a dry runway up here. And you can see that with dry selected, it's still going to give us a wet figure as well. So you get both, which is fairly useful. You should always select a runway exit that is appropriate for the weather conditions. So if it's wet, don't select something that's prior to the wet marker, otherwise the aircraft is obviously not going to be able to do that. So today I want to vacate up here on Bravo 4 so that we really get close to the terminal. So put the marker above it until you see that small blue box come up, click on it and then select Set BTV Exit. With that, we are now getting some additional information up here. So exit Bravo 4 has 2,286 meters to the exit, and the turnaround time, if the reversers are used, is 70 minutes. If the reversers are not used, is 100 minutes. And that's what we want to use. So with that selected, we now hit the auto brake button, and we can see that brake to vacate arms up here in the FMA. And that's everything we need to do. You can also see that we see our exit marked in blue with that blue line over here on the ANF now. Really useful. So that's pretty much everything we had to do. I do hope that you enjoyed this one. Lots of things that you gotta do in the A350 that are a little bit different from your typical conventional Airbus, but it all makes sense if you think about it. So at this point we would now conduct the approach briefing, but that's going to be for a dedicated video that I'll post at some point later on. So thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this one. Be sure to leave your feedback in the comments underneath the videos. I'm really looking forward to it. As always, like, comment and subscribe, and if you really love what I'm doing on this channel, I would appreciate a small donation through the Buy Me Coffee link in the video description below. Thank you very much for watching, and I'm looking forward to see you all again on the next one.